everybody. My name's Luke McBain. I work a lot on leadership and especially on the concept that leadership is an art form. Now, just the other day, I ran across a book and I read it with greatest interest. This book right here, Andrey Tarkovsky, Sculpting in Time. And I was really surprised. Within this book, there's a lot of things which I'm actually working on and which I really do believe in. And Tarkovsky also describes art the way I would describe leadership. So I thought it would be a good idea to read a couple of passages from this book. If you think that's interesting, also in terms of leadership, just buy the book, read it for yourself. I find it extremely enlightening how he looks at cinema and art and how that relates to the subject I'm working on and how identical these viewpoints are. Maybe a couple of words to Tarkovsky himself. He's a very well-known filmmaker who used to do movies in the Soviet Union and later also outside. He then left the Soviet Union. His movies are very special, very unique. If you have the chance, go and try to see them on YouTube. There are a couple of movies. I'm not going to refer to the movies myself because I'm more interested in what he has to say about art in general, not his movies, because although there are many, many outstanding artists and many outstanding filmmakers, they not necessarily have the means to describe what it is, what they're doing. That is not that unusual. It's a little bit like in leadership, although you might have very charismatic, very successful personalities, that does not mean they can describe the phenomena of leadership themselves. So in this regard, also art and leadership is very much connected. Well, without much further ado, let's have a look into the book Sculpting in Time. And I'm just going to read some passages and then go through the passage and see how that relates to leadership. And it's very odd how much it does. So let's try that, shall we? All right. So this is a passage from page 26. Of course, he writes, my point of view is subjective, but that is how it has to be in art. In his work, the artist breaks down reality in the prism of his perception and uses a foreshortening technique of his own to show different sides of reality. In setting great store by the subjective view of the artist and his personal perception of the world, however, I'm not making a plea for an arbitrary or anarchic approach. It is a question of worldview, of ideals and moral ends. Masterpieces are born of the artist's struggle to express his ethical ideals. Indeed, his concepts and his sensibilities are informed by those ideals. If he loves life, he has an overwhelming need to know it, change it, try to make it better. In short, if he aims to cooperate in enhancing the value of life, then there's no danger in the fact that the picture of reality will have passed through a filter of his subjective concepts through his states of mind. There's a couple of things, first of all, which is very compelling and very unique, is that he insists on this concept of ethics, of morals, of values in general, and that is central to the work of an artist. And if we look at leadership, we always put values at the center of what constitutes leadership, also ethics and morals. So what is even more interesting is the question of subjectivity. I've struggled myself a lot with leadership theory and the question why most of the leadership models and theories actually don't work. You can't apply them. You might find them interesting, intellectually stimulating, They inform you, they give you a view on leadership, but in their application, very difficult. And one of the reasons why that is because most leadership theory is written from either a social science perspective or a perspective of psychology or behavioral science, etc., etc. And science has the claim to speak objective truth. So something viewed from the outside, in terms of relationships, behaviors, etc. However, in leadership, as in art, the experience is a subjective one, which means every individual who is in that position of responsibility and in that position to create a future for themselves and for others has a very, very subjective experience. And that makes it very difficult for these individuals then to accept that outside view, although they might find it intellectually interesting. Most of them say, well, what has that got to do with me and my personal experience? So there's a huge problem in leadership theory when it comes to subjectivity. However, when you view leadership as an art form, this problem doesn't exist anymore. It's actually part of that view on leadership. So you say art is subjective, it is created within that individual. We never deny that art is something very subjective, and so is leadership. And then you argue, well, if it's subjective, isn't it sort of arbitrary and everybody has their own view on how to do things and what is right and what is wrong and all that? And Tarkovsky points out, and I find this rather brilliant, that he says, well, if you're committed to your values, what's the problem with subjectivity? Because values is something which are expressed through your decisions, through your actions, through how you deal with others, and can be observed from the outside. So even though you might have a subjective impulse to do something, these impulses are, as he points out, filtered through your morals, through your ethics, through your values. Your values are like a lens through which you filter information. He even writes that. He writes, the picture of reality will have passed through a filter of his subjective concepts, through his states of mind. And also this image of a filter I find very interesting, because if you see yourself in that position of responsibility where you try to get an idea of what consequences certain decisions will have for the future, actually what you're doing is you're filtering certain information which is constantly streaming towards you. So that information is coming from the future, basically coming towards you, and while it's coming towards you, you try to filter it into something where you try to make decisions for yourself and others, and you use your values to do that. And that's why values and integrity is so central to leadership. So, very interesting. Subjectivity and values, and how one is actually tied to the other, and why subjectivity is not a problem. So let's read another passage and see what he says there. Because it is a living process, artistic creation demands a capacity for direct observation of the ever-changing material world, which is constantly in movement. Again, it could be a statement about leadership. You could just substitute leadership for artistic creation. We could say, because it is a living process, leadership demands a capacity for direct observation of the ever-changing material world, which is constantly in movement. You can substitute one for the other, and it still makes perfect sense. Because one of the things which you will find yourself challenged with in your personal life, but especially in positions of responsibility, is that ever-changing environment. It's completely fluid. It's never stable. You never quite know what sort of information might pop up from where, what somebody might say, what happens next. It's depending on the complexity of your environment, which can get highly complex when you start to be responsible for a group of people or a certain amount of budget or a certain organizational structure, the complexity is overwhelming. Not only that, the complexity is static, like you look at this complex picture and say, oh my goodness, what's up? But this picture is constantly shifting. It's constantly ever changing and fluid all the time. So what we can already see is that although leadership is something very subjective, there are some, let's say, common principles everywhere. It doesn't matter where you work. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter in what level of responsibility you are in. You will be always challenged by that fluidity, by that information streaming in, and by that impression that everything is highly fluid. Let's have another look at one of his other quotes. Oh, this is good. Okay, so he writes here about technique, and I'll read that part. It's about the technique of our art making. Problems of technique are child's play. You can learn any of it. But thinking independently, worthily, is not like learning to do something, nor is it being an individual. Nobody can be forced to shoulder a weight that is not merely difficult, but at times impossible to bear. But there is no other way. It has to be all or nothing. The man who has stolen in order to never thieve again remains a thief. Nobody who has ever betrayed his principles can have a pure relationship with life. Therefore, when a filmmaker says he will produce a potboiler in order to give himself the strength and the means to make the film of his dreams, that is so much deception, or worse, self-deception. He will never now make his film. And you could say the same about leadership. There is, when he speaks of problems of techniques are child's play, you can learn any of it. That is a little bit like those hands-on leadership advice books which you get, which you say, well, if you want to motivate people, you have to start praising them. You should set an example. You should be that. You should be doing this. This is all technique. And you can learn that. That's not a problem. Like, that's what I always call psycho-manipulation. It's like trying to get into the minds of others so that they finally do what you think they should be doing. And that's all technique. And there's several problems with that, and he's trying to point that out, that that's not good enough. First of all, technique does not substitute art, and technique doesn't substitute leadership either, and especially authentic leadership. There's no substitution for it. Authentic leadership is what it is, and art is what it is. Technique is not art. So that's again another analogy here, or proof that leadership is actually art. It goes beyond that, because people sense actually technique. They sense that you are trying to manipulate something in front of them, or you're trying to manipulate them. And with art, it's the same thing. When you look at something, you feel that somebody's trying to manipulate you. It's a little bit like public relations or advertisement, marketing, all that. Of course, when you look at marketing and advertisement, they're trying to manipulate you to buy something, and you can sense that. And the same goes for leadership. Like if people, start being overly friendly and asking you for your opinion and all that, you sense like, yeah, this person wants something from me. They want something. They want me to be in a good mood and motivated and all that. So he goes further. He says, but thinking independently worthily is not like learning to do something, nor is being an individual. It is more. Nobody can be forced to shoulder a weight that is not merely difficult, but at times impossible to bear. But there is no other way. It has to be all or nothing. And what he means here is actually that if you take upon yourself a certain set of values, which you believe in, and that is shouldering that set of values. And everybody who has done that in their life in a position of responsibility, has believed in anything, has felt that as a burden, because you are constantly challenged by your environment, by the ever-changing environment, by those challenges, by those difficulties. to give up your values, not to believe in them anymore, to adapt, to conform, to trade them in, to bargain in them some way. So it feels like a burden. And those who hold on to their values and believe in them feel it as a burden. But to really find out if your values actually have any effect on your environment, on building a future, you have to hold on to them. So that's what he means by it's either all or nothing. Like, you can't find out if your values are really of use to you unless you hold on to them. If you let them go, you never will find out if they have been of any use, because you gave up on them. And there he goes, like, the man who has stolen in order never to thieve again remains a thief. Nobody who has ever betrayed his principles can have a pure relationship with life. That's the point, isn't it? So if you're in a position of responsibility, of leadership, and you've traded in your values for something else in return, you've bargained them off, you will never find out what your relationship with life is really like. So, and also the best, so the point of self-deception, or worse, self-deception, he will never make his film. And that also connects to leadership again. If you do not shoulder your own values and live them and believe in them, you will never create your future. And this is the main point of that statement. From his book, Sculpting in Time, let's have a look what this is good. You and the others. So this quote is about, people always ask me, well, what about the others? What about the relationship between the people who lead and the people who follow and all that? Because that's a very old duality, which is an artificial duality in my opinion. It's not a real duality. Basically, due to behavioral science, social science, which has always described the relationship between those two groups of people, those who lead and those who follow. But this is a false distinction, and he makes also this point. Has anyone ever conducted a survey or made the slightest conscientious effort to discover the people's true interests, their ways of thinking, expectation, hopes, or indeed disappointments? I am a part of my people. I have lived with my fellow citizens, been through the same bit of history as anyone else of my age, observed and thought about the same happenings and processes, and even now in the West, I remain a son of my country. I am a fragment of it, a particle, and I hope that I express ideas that stem from deep within our cultural and historical traditions. So here it's about the relationship between the artist and his or her audience, right? And he's going into this, well, who am I doing my art for? And this is the same as in leadership. Who am I doing leadership for? So then it's about the others. So he goes like, well, the whole assumption that I as an individual, if I believe in something, am not already in my individuality part of something bigger is preposterous. Like, this whole notion that we are culturally completely separate from other people and we don't share common values and beliefs is crazy, honestly. So to have this assumption that this bond or this relationship constantly needs some sort of like special attention is not very healthy, in fact, because it has this underlying notion that we don't have anything in common. We don't share anything. We don't have any common values. We don't have a common culture. We don't have a common tradition. We don't have common dreams, aspirations, etc., etc. And this is, of course, not true. This is just crazy if you think like that. What you should be thinking is that if you have beliefs and if you have values and you express them, that you should also have the belief that you believe in something universal, which is the much more interesting question. Like, what do you believe, and do you actually believe in any universal values which you're willing to bear and to defend and to express in your environment, or not? So all this sort of psychomanipulation of saying getting people motivated or entertaining them or trying to get them to do something is rather an expression of the lack in the belief of values. Because if you have values and express them, you are automatically connected to others. There's no other way. Immediately that will resonate with others, and they will resonate with these values which you believe in, which you express, and which you will base your decisions on. There is no other way. He says again, I hope that I express ideas that stem from deep within our cultural and historical traditions. Well, of course he does. And of course you do if you decide to believe in anything. Let's move on and have another look. We accept that an honorable action may bring pressure down on us or even bring us into conflict with our milieu. Why are we not prepared for the trouble that can ensue from our professional activities? Why are we afraid of being called to task when we embark on a film? Why do we start by taking out an insurance so that the picture will be meaningless? Is it not because we want to receive instant remuneration for our work in the form of cash and comfort? One can only be staggered by the hubris of modern artists if we compare them, say, to the humble builders of Chartres Cathedral, whose names are not even known. The artist ought to be distinguished by selfless devotion to duty, but we forgot about that a long time ago. So again, the question is that of struggle. So I think what he's trying to say is that if you believe in something, if you have values, if you believe in whatever that might be, hard work, success, equality, serving others, there's no way you can believe in those values and you can, shape something out of that stream of information which is coming towards you into something meaningful without struggle. There's always going to be resistance to that. There's always going to be people who doubt that, who say, do you really believe that? Do you really that makes any sense? Look around you. Look how everybody is acting, like in their own personal self-interest. Like, who believes in that anymore? And he even claims that the idea of selfless commitment and duty has been forgotten a long time ago. I doubt that. I think there's still people out there who believe in something and struggle to attain that, but we have to distinguish. We have to distinguish of the people who actually do that and people who have forgotten how to do that. Let's have another last quote here, and I think that's also very, very interesting. This is also good. Yeah. This is about the balance of principles. Art embodied an ideal. It was an example of perfect balance between moral and material principles, a demonstration of the fact that such a balance is not a myth existing only in the realm of ideology, but something that can be realized within the dimensions of the phenomenal world. Art expressed man's of harmony and his readiness to do battle with himself, within his own personality, for the sake of achieving the equilibrium for which he longed. Why I find this interesting is, and I also talk about that, is that I say, although leadership is art, it doesn't mean that it's the absence of rationality or materialism. And he also makes the case, the balance between moral or values and material principles. So, and that's important to say. There's something still, it's not a purely spiritual idea. It's something which interacts with the material world, as he said, like, which tries to make sense of the material world, which is based on also on material rational principles of the interaction with the material world. And the same, of course, applies to leadership. You are bound to the material world. You have to deal with it somehow. Yeah? In a company, you have to make money in some way. And in any institution, you have to provide a service or a good or whatever it is. So you're bound to these material principles, and there's nothing bad about that. And there's no problem at seeing as an art form. The artists also have to deal with the material world. They deal with the material world which is around them as a society, but also in producing their art. It's a material process. They have to learn how to mix the colors, how to operate a camera, whatnot, how to get the funding for their projects, etc. So it also is bound with the material world there. So, again, the question of doing battle with yourself. So, very often, this is also not much expressed in leadership theory, that there is this struggle within yourself, what that would mean to believe in certain principles and act them out and see that they are in the best interest for yourself and others. So you say, if this is a universal value and it works for me and it works for everybody else because it's universal, shouldn't by my actions also something good come out of it? And this is a constant struggle. This is a constant struggle, especially with yourself. Are you willing to give up on that belief or not? And people who don't experience that struggle apparently don't have values or don't know what that means or don't believe in anything. So anybody who teaches leadership or stands there as a prime example and says, I know how this works, and doesn't talk about that struggle, that internal struggle, that's the main work, I don't think they're an honest communicator for that subject. Okay, so that was a couple of quotes from this book, Sculpting in Time. Maybe I'll read from it again. There are some other aspects which I haven't mentioned, especially in regards to the title, which I find very interesting. I think leadership, in a sense, is a sculpting process. It is sculpting a reality in time from that information which we encounter. And that is actually the leadership process. And the also maybe as a side note, not only Tarkovsky mentions this process of sculpting, so does Beuys, which is a very well-known German artist, a sculptor who coined the term social sculpture. So there is something in that, and he also explains that more in the book. But perhaps that will be then a subject for another video, where I go more into the notion how he deals with time and how he sees time, which I find is very, very interesting and also very useful, because in leadership, again, time is of the essence. Time is central, right? So because we don't sense we have control over that, and how to regain that, how to make time our personal time, or the time for that what we intend to achieve, is quite central as a question in leadership. And I think there's some very good pointers within that book, and I'll go into that more when I revisit Tarkovsky. So thanks again for listening. I hope you're fine, and looking forward to your comments. Take care.